Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to the second and final evening of our two-part event regarding the 2020 United States presidential election issues and implications. We appreciate you all participating. If you attended yesterday's lecture by Professor James Gardner, you were able to learn why one of the leading experts of US election law describes the US system for electing president as complex, confusing, and internally inconsistent. For those of you who did not attend or would like to hear Professor Gardner's lecture and Q&A again, we will be posting a link to the recording of yesterday's session, along with a recording of today's session on YouTube and Bilibili. Both links will be available on STL's website and WeChat account. Today, we will be looking again at several of the legal and policy issues in the 2020 US presidential election. We'll be hearing from 4 speakers, each of whom will speak for about 15 minutes. We then will have a question and answer period after all 4 speakers have concluded their remarks. Our first speaker will be Ellen Campbell, a former lawyer with the leading law firm Cleary Gottlieb in New York City, who resigned from the firm to serve as Assistant Director of Voter Protection for the Democratic Party of the state of Wisconsin, one of the key battleground states in the 2020 election. Just yesterday, the Trump campaign paid $3 million for a recount of the votes in Wisconsin's 2 most populous regions or counties. We then will hear from STL Professor Duncan Alford, who will discuss some of the differences in absentee voting and ballot counting in 3 key southern state battlegrounds: North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Mail-in absentee voting was a very contentious issue in the 2020 presidential election and remains a contentious issue. Professor Thomas Man will then offer his insights into presidential voting by Chinese Americans, who I believe we may hear tended to favor Donald Trump. Finally, Professor Mark Feldman, who was an official with the United States State Department prior to joining STL, will offer his views on the foreign policy implications of the 2020 presidential election, including the implications for China-US relations. So if you will please join me in welcoming today's speakers. We will then hear from Ellen Campbell and Professors Alford, Mann, and Feldman.
I guess that's my cue. Morning, everybody. It's 6:30 in the morning over here in Wisconsin. And today, as the professor notes, is the first day that we start our recount in Madison and Milwaukee. Dane and Milwaukee County are the 2 most prominently Democratic counties in the state, which is one of the reasons why they were selected. You're probably wondering what voter protection is. So like Professor McConaughey said, I am the Deputy Director of Voter Protection here in Wisconsin for the Wisconsin Democratic Party and the Biden-Harris campaign. Voter protection, as you learned yesterday, laws in every state are different because election laws are state-focused mostly. So you heard about that theoretically yesterday. What that means in practice is that, for example, if you live in Ohio, just like a 3-hour drive from where I am in Wisconsin or so, well, maybe more like 5-hour drive, geography, you have to register a month before the election or you can't vote. In Wisconsin, where I am right now, you can register on election day. In Texas, you can only vote absentee if you're over the age of 65 or if you have a medical excuse. In Wisconsin, where I am right now, you can vote absentee without any excuse. In Illinois, which is 2 hours south of here, you can vote absentee and they verify your ballot by matching your signature with a record on file. In Wisconsin, you don't need to match your signature, but you do need to have a witness sign your certification envelope and provide their full address to verify that it's you that voted. And so, as you can imagine, for a lot of voters who may not live in the same place their entire lives and may move from state to state, these requirements are extremely confusing. So I would say that the vast bulk of what voter protection does is various forms of education, much like your professors on this call. So we do this in different ways. We set up a voter protection hotline and push the number out around the state. So if you had a question about voting, you could call us. This required training a large number of volunteers to answer questions on that hotline, and then training our volunteers to train volunteers. My mother was one of my volunteers, and then she graduated to hotline manager, where she trained many more volunteers to use the software and answer the questions that voters have about how to register, how to request an absentee ballot, where they can vote early, where they can vote in person on election day, what sort of photo ID they have to show in order to vote. As I mentioned, the answers to all of these questions are state specific. And so even if you have been voting in Chicago all your life and you just moved to Wisconsin, the laws are going to change pretty drastically on you, and you're going to have to learn the new ways of the road. So the hotline is one thing that we did. In addition, we put over 1,000 poll observers into the field on election day in order to have people on site to answer voter questions when voters had questions, to help them know how to register, how to, what photo ID they could show that would be valid to vote. These laws can be extremely complicated, and while voting should be easy, it is easier when you have a free consultant there to help you out with it. And so that's the bulk of what voter protection does, is just try to help people understand how to vote. I'm going to, just as a form of vanity, I'm going to show my screen and show one of our biggest projects. So vote.wisdems.org. Let me just pull that up. Oops. Oh no, they pulled it down. Never mind. Never mind. So apparently our tech people are really on top of their game. And even though the election was just a couple weeks ago, they've already pulled down our website. In some states, elections are administered at the county level, which means that every county runs its own elections, and they're responsible for recruiting poll workers and putting people in the field to run the election. In Wisconsin, we are a little more decentralized than that, and each municipal clerk, of which there are about 1,900, has jurisdiction over running their election. So in order to run an election in Wisconsin, 1,900 municipal clerks are individually responsible for recruiting poll workers, for making sure they have materials, for making sure they have the necessary machines, for making sure that all of the poll workers are trained. This posed unexpected challenges this year during the pandemic, when, first off, a lot of the poll workers that usually work are older. I think 56% of poll workers are typically over the age of 65. At least they were in 2016. And so, as you know, that population is at much higher risk for COVID-19. This meant in our April election, a large proportion of the traditional poll workers did not feel safe showing up and did not show up to work the polls, which meant that we had less polling locations, which meant that voters who normally just walk 3 blocks to vote at the place that they've always voted at suddenly have to take 5 buses across the city and wait in a 5-hour line in order to vote. And if I recall correctly, it was hailing on April 7th during this election. So they were waiting in 4-hour lines in the hail in order to vote. It was pretty inspirational, but also terrible. I remember being on the phone with one woman on April 7th who was a Black woman who was born in the South before civil rights. She was 80 years old, and of course, like, high risk for COVID. And so she was calling to find out if there was any other way she could vote besides in person at that point. At that point, unfortunately, there was no other way. There was no way to get an absentee ballot. The only way was to vote in person. And so I somewhat reluctantly had to tell her, like, look, this is your option. Like, you either vote in person, or you don't vote this election. Wait until the next one. And she told me that she knew what disenfranchisement felt like because she'd felt it in the South in her youth. And she walked out of that house and went across town to wait in what turned out to be 4-hour lines in the hail. That just sort of really underlines to me, like, how much people care about their rights and about voting. And it's been really hard this year, but what has been really clear working in voter protection is how much people really care about doing this. This year in the United States, we saw turnout through the roof, like higher than we normally see. Some countries, you may be aware, like Australia, taxes people that don't vote. In the United States, that's not the case. It's your choice, it's your right, but it's also your choice. And if you do choose to do it, then you do have to jump through all the logistical hurdles and figure out, what the rules are in your state in order to get it done. But this year, just an unprecedented number of people jumped through all of those logistical hurdles and figured out how to vote in the midst of a pandemic in order to do it. Which leads me to my second main topic, which is absentee ballots, which has been on the news a lot. So I mentioned that one of the challenges for the municipal clerks this year has been getting enough poll workers because the ones that they traditionally have are older. And so this we solved by doing mass recruitment among young people, people your age, students mostly, unemployed bartenders, people that are younger and lower risk and might not say no to the fact that poll working is a paid job and comes with a daily paycheck of, enough money to get you through a couple more grocery cycles. That was one aspect. The other aspect was getting a lot of people who have never voted absentee before to learn the rules of voting absentee. So, like I said, in Wisconsin, you don't need an excuse to vote absentee. And while that's not true in every state, at least that's true here. You can just request your absentee ballot and then return it in the way that seems best to you. You can put it in the mail, you can deliver it to your clerk, you can put it in a drop box. Now, the sticky problem comes in two ways. First off, in 2016, maybe 6% of Wisconsinites voted absentee. That's not very many. In April 2020, something like 70% of the population of the state voted absentee. That's a whole lot of people to teach how to vote absentee because the rules are a little different. And the techniques are a little different. And you have to learn how to use the website, or you have to learn how to, figure out how to scan your ID and send it in. It required a lot of education. The other area in which it was difficult was for municipal clerks. Like I said, there's 1,900 municipal clerks, each responsible for running their own elections. And on election day, just having people file in and out, like once you get your software set up, look, like it's a reasonable amount of work. Absentee ballots, on the other hand, are a huge amount of work. Every single one of them has to be initialed by the municipal clerk. They have to be like physically put into their envelopes and folded and like checked to make sure that the right ballot is going to the right voter. And then they have to be mailed. And then if they come back with errors, the clerk has the discretion to try and help the voter figure out how to correct it. Because if your absentee ballot comes back and you don't have a witness signature, they can't count that ballot. The only way that you can get your vote counted is if you somehow come in with your witness and you correct that ballot. And the only way that's going to happen is if your clerk lets you know that there's a problem. So some municipalities are maybe 50 people. Others are the city of Milwaukee with hundreds of thousands of voters. And so you begin to see the logistical difficulties inherent in setting up this whole operation and the amount of work it took for municipal clerks to do this. Our role in this was more one of lobbying, sharing best practices. For example, one thing that we learned pretty early on is that on your absentee ballot envelope, if you highlight the sections that are required to be filled out, it naturally draws your eye to it, and you're more likely to fill it out and actually properly get it done so that your vote will properly be counted. Other municipalities were not highlighting, and so we made a point of calling those municipal clerks and letting them know that this could drastically improve the rates of success of their voters, and we got a bunch of them to start highlighting. Other things we did is we lobbied the Wisconsin Elections Commission, the overall body that administers elections, to put in a tag in their downloadable voter file for ballots that had been mailed back to the voter for correction. So if you send in a ballot that, for example, doesn't have a witness signature, the clerk has two options. They can just sit on it and reject it and your vote gets thrown away, or they can mail it back to you and give you the option to correct it. And if they mail it back to you and they mark it in the system, then we were able to look you up and get your phone number and call you to try to talk you through the process of how to correct it. This, of course, is a lot of work that is not necessary in a typical election year where all you have to do is show up, show your photo ID, and vote. I I think one thing that doesn't get talked about a lot when people are talking about voter protection, you see these glamorous lawsuits, and it looks like we're heading to one of those glamorous lawsuits here in Wisconsin. And we did have some ongoing litigation in the background throughout this entire time. But the nuts and bolts of voter protection is really just sort of logistics and education. And, it's a lot of tech support, like a shocking amount of tech support, whether you're helping voters figure out how to use the My Vote website for the first time, or helping your volunteers learn how to use our voter protection website, LBJ, for the first time. But it's not always as glamorous as you think it's going to be, but it is a really rewarding and valuable way to spend a year, in my experience. I will break for questions.
Thank you, Ellen. I think we'll proceed with all four of you speakers first, and then have questions and answers after that. But thank you. That's extremely interesting and important and valuable work. Duncan?
Yes. Good morning in the US, good evening in China. What I wanted to do today was talk about and sort of follow up with what Ellen was talking about, sort of the nuts and bolts of how elections run in the US. And in particular, I was going to focus on 3 different states. Professor Gardner in his talk yesterday, and Ellen Campbell mentioned also that election law in the United States really is a matter of state law. And so in some ways, we have 50 separate elections on election day because the laws can vary so much in the states. I'm going to describe and compare selected features of the voting laws in 3 states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And I've selected those because I currently live in South Carolina, and I have lived and voted in elections, in different elections in all 3 of those states. And I'm licensed to practice law in all 3 of those states. So one thing you have to do, and Ellen mentioned this, in order to vote in an election in the United States, you do have to register to vote. And you fill out an application. And in these 3 states, you have to register to vote at least 30 days prior to the election. None of these states have election day registration. And there are 3 ways to vote an election in the United States. These varies by state. Ellen mentioned absentee voting, which is voting by mail or putting a ballot in a special box near the Board of Elections in these states. There's also a method of early voting. Most people, when they think of the election, they think of going in person on the election day, but some states allow early voting. So they set up polling places several weeks prior to the election, and you can vote. So you can either vote in person on election day, early voting where it's allowed, and then there's absentee voting, and there are many requirements for that. North Carolina and Georgia allow early voting. And in North Carolina this year, you could have gone to a special polling place between October 15th, October 31st to vote. In Georgia, you could have gone to a special voting place between October 12th and October 30th. South Carolina does not allow early voting. So in South Carolina, you can only do absentee voting or present yourself at a polling place on election day. All 3 states do allow absentee voting, and all 3 states require a witness on the absentee ballot. But in order to get an absentee ballot, there were deadlines to request one in each of those states, and you had to go online and print out an application and put in certain information, and then you had to mail it in, and your ballot was mailed to you. And as Ellen mentioned, these requirements can be very strict. Typically in these states, all 3 states required a witness as well as your signature on the absentee ballot. And that can be complicated. In South Carolina, it was even more complicated because a court decision came out during the absentee ballot voting period that said a witness signature wasn't required. And then that decision was reversed and a witness signature is required. So that was confusing. For absentee ballots, Also, there's the process of actually mailing them or turning them in, and that varies by state. In North Carolina, your absentee ballot, if you submitted it by mail, had to be postmarked by election day, which was November 3rd this year, but it could be received by November 12th. So any absentee ballot received after November 12th was not counted. In Georgia and South Carolina, your absentee ballot had to be received by election day. So that varies by state. And these states are in the southern United States and all adjacent to each other and have different rules. There are also different rules in how the absentee ballots are processed and when they can be processed. And what I mean by that is the County Board of Elections can actually open the envelopes and start counting the ballots. So in North Carolina, they can actually start processing the ballots 5 weeks prior to Election Day. The counting doesn't begin until 2 weeks prior to the election day, and those results are not released until the polls close on election day, but they can actually do the work of processing the ballots. In South Carolina, nothing can begin until 9 a.m. on election day. And there were many absentee ballots because of the pandemic in all 3 of these states. In Georgia, the ballots could be processed on receipt, but the actually counting of them could not begin until 7 a.m. on election day. So you can see the very differences, and these differences have real effects on when the election results are released to the public. Ellen also mentioned that polling places were not only there were fewer polling places, and there was a difficulty in recruiting poll workers. And that was the case in all 3 states. The election laws in the states define what locations can serve as polling places. And many churches in the United States are not holding services currently because of the pandemic. And particularly in the South, churches tend to be polling places. So many churches and community centers were not open to their constituents or their parishioners, and therefore they withdrew as being a polling place. So there were fewer polling places, and that was driven by the pandemic. Now, once all these votes are processed and counted, there is a process and a possibility for a recount. And Ellen Campbell mentioned that a recount is occurring in certain counties in Wisconsin. A recount is occurring in Georgia currently, but the process and the deadlines and the rights to a recount vary by states. And so a recount is where the Secretary of State goes back through all the ballots and verifies their work. In North Carolina, a candidate can request a recount if there was 0.5% or 10,000 votes, whichever is less, difference between the 2 candidates. There is no requested recount procedure in South Carolina. North Carolina, the candidate can request a recount if there's a margin of difference of 0.5%. At the end of all this process, and I'm just going through selected features, the Secretary of State of these 3 states must certify the election, and that is a public declaration that the account is complete and is the official results of the account. And that varies by state. In North Carolina, the election results are certified or must be certified within 3 weeks after the election, and that is November 24th. So we are not yet at the deadline for certification in North Carolina. In South Carolina, the results must be certified 1 week and a day after the election, and that is November 11th of this year. And so they have already been certified in South Carolina. In Georgia, the election results must be certified 11 days after the election. And in fact, that is today, November 20th. So sometime today, the Secretary of State of Georgia will be certifying those results. The presidential results in Georgia were very close. 0.25% was the difference in margin between the two presidential candidates. And there was the Secretary of State ordered automatic recount for that, but those election results are supposed to be certified today. Another feature I wanted to just mention generally about the southern states, Ellen Campbell is working in Wisconsin, which is in the upper Midwest. I am in the southeastern of the United States, one of the southern states. And Ellen mentioned that one voter remembers voter suppression prior to the civil rights movement in the South. One effect of the voter suppression that occurred in the 1960s as part of the civil rights movement was the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And one requirement of that act was that selected southern states, if they made changes to their election laws or procedures, had to submit that change to the US Department of Justice, a federal agency, for pre-clearance. And that clearance required approval and analysis that the change in the election law would not suppress the rights of minority voters, in particular Black voters. In 2013, there was a US Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, and it was a 5-4 decision that removed that requirement, that pre-clearance requirement for voting laws in the South. The court in a 5-4 decision said that requirement was unconstitutional and was no longer necessary. So since 2013, that additional pre-clearance requirement is no longer in effect in the southern states, where there had been a history of voter suppression throughout the late 19th and 20th century. That was a lot of information at once. But I wanted to highlight the differences, and I admit, I agree with Professor Gardner. The election law in the United States can be confusing, and it varies greatly state by state. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. Professor Mann. You're on mute, I believe. Okay.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, you can hear me now. Okay, I'd like to turn to a little bit of different topic here to offer some observations relating to Chinese Americans in the current 2020 general election. First, let me try to clarify some basic facts. Demographically, Chinese Americans comprise the largest ethnic group of the Asian American population, usually identified in the census as the Americans and Pacific Islanders, or AAPI. Currently, there are more than 22 million Asian Americans, of which Chinese Americans consist of 5.2 million, about 25%. But different statistical data sometimes can be confusing, uses slightly different definition of so-called Chinese American. The 5.2 million figure seems to refer to a broader definition of Chinese Americans, covering not only Chinese American citizens, but also permanent residents, so-called green card holders, and holders of various immigrant or non-immigrant visas, such as students, who are citizens of either China or some other country or regions, but now currently living in the US. So by another calculation, Chinese American citizens of Chinese descent, currently have a population about 3.7 million, comprising about 1.2% of the total US population. Thus, when we talk about Chinese Americans as so-called a voting group, we actually talk about the 3.7 Chinese American citizens who are eligible to vote in the election. Given it's a small number among the US voting population, its actual impact on the outcome of the general election is naturally limited. However, because of several reasons, in this year's general election, Chinese Americans, including not only citizens, but also non-citizens, have displayed unprecedented enthusiasm and generated unprecedented political discussion and debates, not only amongst themselves, but also among all Chinese in the US, as well as in China and other regions of the world. This is truly unprecedented. Oh, I'm sorry here for using the word repeatedly, unprecedented, but it's truly unprecedented phenomena. Namely, once like it's a routine, every 4 years, US presidential election has somehow captured the attention of all Chinese around the globe to become the most talked about event by every Chinese in the US and everywhere, especially in Chinese language media outlets of all kinds. How come? There are many reasons. I listed here 3, which I believe are highly relevant. First reason, the Chinese reaction to President Trump's policy towards China. The Trump administration, we all know, started the trade war with China, and other actions relating to China represent a drastic departure from US-China policy for the last 40 years. Although Trump's China policy may not be a significant factor for the American general public in the election, it caused huge debates among Chinese, both for and against. The second reason, COVID-19. The coronavirus affected almost everyone in the world, but it particularly strained the US-China relationship internationally, and in the domestic front, heightened the racial and ethnic sensitivity involving Chinese as an ethnic group in the US society. Trump and China, we all know, exchanged the blames on the pandemic. Trump used such phrases as the China virus and Kung Fu virus, which added fuel to the racial tension in the aftermath of the George Floyd tragedy. Again, Chinese around the world split on the related issues, sparking another line of heated debate. The third reason, I think there are a great number of new immigrants from China, and I would call it Andrew Yang effect. In the US, Chinese Americans have historically been less active in politics than most other ethnic groups. They normally did not talk about politics with family members and relatives, but this has changed dramatically in recent years. Since the 1980s, a great number of Chinese immigrants from mainland China came to the US, and many become US citizens. I got to say, I'm one of them. Of the 3.7 million Chinese American citizens, about 2 million are so-called first-generation immigrants. The remaining 1.7 million are American-born Chinese, or usually we call them ABCs. This first generation of immigrants found an opportunity which they believe did not exist before their transplantation to the US to participate in political life. They enthusiastically embraced this opportunity. At the same time, the 2020 election included a Chinese American presidential candidate, Andrew Yang. By the way, Professor Mark Feldman, who is going to speak next, is a classmate of Andrew Yang at Columbia Law School. Although Andrew Yang is not the first American presidential candidate from a major political party, this honor goes to Hiram Fang, who in 1964 received delegates votes as a Republican candidate at the Republican National Convention. But Andrew Yang achieved much greater success and publicity in his campaign to qualify, taking part in 7 of the first 8 Democratic debates. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about how Chinese Americans voted in this election, and then try to comment on the major issues that either influenced or actually divided their votes. And the voting group, like most other Asian American ethnic groups, Chinese Americans have largely voted Democrats, generally by a margin 2-1. This election seems not really much different. We still, at this point, don't have the precise statistical data, but various exit polls show more than 60% Chinese Americans voted for Joe Biden. While these preliminary results indicate a historical continuity, there are a few noteworthy developments. Here I mention only two. First, along with the National Committee of Asian American Republicans, the National Committee of the Chinese American Republicans openly endorsed Joe Biden, reversing its position in 2016. This is clearly a direct response from Chinese Americans to Trump's racially charged rhetoric and policy in handling racial tensions in general, like refusal to condemn white supremacy and hostility to Black Lives Matter protest, and the pandemic in particular, like using the phrase China virus and Kung Fu virus. Second development, I think, is more significant. There appears to be a clear division between the first generation of Chinese immigrants, especially Chinese American voters born in China, and their children born in the US. While Chinese Americans born in the US, so ABCs tend to vote Democrats, a higher percentage of first generation of Chinese immigrants supports Republicans. According to some estimate, about 1/3 of Chinese American voters are born outside the US. Thus, they are first generation voters. And at least according to some literary, not statistical evidence, most of the strongest Trump supporters are found in the first generation Chinese immigrants. Many of them came from mainland China. How to explain this phenomenon? I try offer here a few personal observations. First, as first generation of immigrants, the first-time voters stand across two countries with vastly different value systems. Their life experience in China makes them culturally and socially conservative, firmly believing in law and order and detesting their perceived racially radical socially liberal concepts and policies regarding, for example, transgender, legalization, marijuana, and feminism, etc. Thus, developing kind of aversion to the social policies of the Democratic Party. Second, I think is very important is the emphasis on education by Chinese lead those Chinese immigrants, especially the first generation from China, to almost single-mindedly seek the best education for their children. In general, Chinese American students perform better academically because mainly they spend more time in classroom and schoolwork than students in most other ethnic groups, are more likely to qualify to enter the best colleges and universities. Their parents, newly from China, believe that affirmative action and other diversity programs discriminate against their children, thus supporting the Republican agenda to eliminate affirmative action and fight against so-called reverse discrimination. But just interesting to note, it's ironic that most of the children of this first generation Chinese strongly disagree with their parents. A third reason, I believe, many first generation Chinese Americans seem to have applied the same set of notions about the Chinese society and politics to their new home in the US, projecting a kind of anachronistic view of US society and politics. For instance, some of them have had the terrible experience in the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s, when government institutions were paralyzed leading to social chaos and lawlessness. Such memory makes them afraid of any kind of social unrest and lack of social order, thus turning to Trump's law and order rhetoric. There are also a good number of first-generation immigrants who, for one reason or another, believe they have had negative experience of socialism in China. Therefore, they view any social policy or political agenda in the US that favors social welfare, government regulation of business, or redistribution of wealth as a prelude to socialism. They believe that these are not policy issues that can be debated between political parties, but in their view, evil designs or conspiracies by a Democratic Party to socialize America. As a result, they develop a more zealous stance in supporting the American conservative politics to the extent idolizing Trump as a savior of America from socialism and cultural degeneration. It's also interesting to note that most important than the actual impact on the ballot, Chinese Americans who vote for Trump tend to be extremely vocal with their position. They are joined by other Chinese in the US and everywhere, including in China, who have no voting right in election, in openly and loudly voicing their ardent support for Trump and his right-wing politics. This makes this year's US election the most divisive event among Chinese across the globe, pitting family members and relatives against each other and splitting long-held friendships. I think that lastly, observation is that not only the America will have to endure for many years to come the severe pain resulting from the polarization of politics and the social unrest of the 2020 general election. The Chinese Americans around the world, not only in the US, to the very large extent, will also have to go through a long period of division and a fierce disagreement in political opinion about American politics. Thank you.
Thank you, very interesting. I look forward to people asking questions about that. Professor Feldman will conclude the remarks and then we'll move to Q&A with some comments on the implications of the 2020 election for US foreign policy.
Thanks, Dean McConaughey. And my remarks today are based on an incoming Biden administration. And I'd like to address three aspects of foreign policy implications. First, short-term engagement. Second, long-term commitment. And third, a few thoughts on the US-China relationship. On short-term engagement, I think we can expect an immediate significant increase in international engagement by the United States. This would include rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization, and the Iran nuclear deal. International engagement in areas of trade and investment are more difficult to predict given existing divisions within the Democratic Party. I can briefly address three issues in the area of trade and investment. First, the World Trade Organization. Second, the CPTPP Free Trade Agreement. And third, selection of a US trade representative. In connection with the World Trade Organization, I expect that a Biden administration would share many of the concerns that have been raised by the Trump administration, but tactics aimed at addressing those concerns, I think, would be very different. Under the Trump administration, the US has blocked appointments of appellate body members and currently is blocking the appointment of a new WTO Director General. These moves have undermined the proper functioning of the institution. I would expect a Biden administration to place greater importance on the continued functioning of the WTO, while continuing to raise some of the same concerns that have been raised by the Trump administration in particular concerns of perceived overreach by appellate body members. On the CPTPP free trade agreement, there currently are two so-called mega-regional free trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region: the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. These two FTAs will shape economic activity in the Asia-Pacific region over the coming decades. The United States is not part of either agreement. For years, the Obama administration led negotiations of what was then known as the TPP and what today is called CPTPP. Given that the TPP agreement was so closely associated with the Obama administration, and given that the RCEP agreement, which includes China but not the US, has just been concluded, I expect that a Biden administration will seek to rejoin the CPTPP. Indeed, there is only one reason why I have any doubt over whether a Biden administration might seek to rejoin the CPTPP, and that is, again, current divisions within the Democratic Party. A significant portion of the Democratic Party today is less than enthusiastic about the United States entering into free trade agreements, or at least FTAs as we have understood them over the past 30 years. Related to US prospects for rejoining the CPTPP will be the appointment of a US trade representative who will lead the work of the Office of the US Trade Representative, which oversees US trade and investment negotiations with other countries. The individuals who have served as US trade representative often have had quite different perspectives with respect to balancing the interests of US workers at home with opportunities for US enterprises abroad. For example, Robert Lighthizer and Robert Zellick served as US trade representative in Republican administrations, but had quite different orientations with respect to trade and investment law rulemaking. The selection of a US trade representative by a Biden administration could provide important insights on the potential future direction of US trade and investment policy. I would turn now to my second topic, long-term commitment. A return to US international engagement by a Biden administration will face challenges associated with doubts over the medium to long-term orientation of the United States. The United States has withdrawn from the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, and the United States has blocked key appointments at the WTO. The world is well aware that Donald Trump received far more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016. The world sees the 72 million voters who chose Trump in 2020. I expect that for some time, the United States will be seen as being only one election away from withdrawing yet again from global engagement. Securing meaningful achievements through international engagement requires years of commitment. For the United States, convincing allies that such commitment has returned will be a major challenge. A Biden administration could at least take important first steps toward restoring confidence in the long-term commitment of the United States to international rulemaking and institution building. And third, I will offer a few thoughts on the US-China relationship. I would like to focus in particular on one initiative, the US-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. This bilateral dialogue has existed in varying forms for nearly 2 decades, dating back to the George W. Bush administration. I expect that a Biden administration will be committed to preserving, or perhaps even expanding, the strategic and economic dialogue, or at least maintaining a regular bilateral dialogue in some form. I think the strategic and economic dialogue provides a significant opportunity for the Biden administration for a few reasons. First, a forum that allows for frequent senior level exchanges is necessary for the United States and China to be able to work through challenging policy issues. Second, over the years, the strategic and economic dialogue has been able to operate in a relatively discreet manner, largely avoiding the glare of the media spotlight. The ability of the strategic and economic dialogue to provide a relatively discreet forum for talking through challenging issues could be quite helpful for a Biden administration, given, again, the existing divisions within the Democratic Party and the reality that certain voices within the Democratic Party have been less than enthusiastic about engagement with China. I do expect a Biden administration to be interested in preserving a strategic and economic dialogue in some form, which again could be quite helpful for the overall US-China relationship. And thank you again.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers for very interesting remarks and insights about the 2020 election and the various issues they discussed. We'll now have questions and answers. In room 201, we will have a microphone that students may use. And everyone participating remotely, please feel free to submit a question in the chat room. Maybe I'll start with a quick question, perhaps to Ellen Campbell and Duncan, or any of the four speakers. Months before the election, President Trump seemed to work very hard to publicly cast doubt on mail-in votes, the authenticity, the accuracy, etc. Why was this? I mean, what was the strategy of taking that stand so long before the election occurred? And was there any evidence at all to suggest that that doubt in mail-in voting was warranted?
It was particularly interesting as a strategy since mail-in voting has traditionally been used more prominently by Republicans. For example, in Wisconsin, which is frigidly cold in the wintertime, a lot of older people who skew Republican tend to be snowbirds. Like they'll have a winter place in Florida or Texas or somewhere. And so they might continue to vote in Wisconsin, but because they leave Wisconsin in mid-October, they'll vote absentee. I happen to know that Scott Walker, the former Republican governor of Wisconsin, voted absentee this year. It was always an interesting tactic to me to try to create some division where there was none. First off, the rules for voting absentee in Wisconsin are the same in 2020 as they were in 2016, when Trump won the absentee vote by large margins. And the requirements that you have to jump through in order to get an absentee ballot here in Wisconsin are Byzantine. This is why it took so much work to train people in like how to use the software successfully. You have to show a copy of your photo ID, a good photo ID for voting in order to get an absentee ballot. You have to, once you receive the absentee ballot, you have to make sure that a witness sees you fill it out and is willing to sign under penalty of perjury that they saw you fill it out and provide their address. I don't see how you game this system in the numbers that you would need to flip an election. Frankly, I think it's absolutely absurd, the allegations that absentee voting is not safe and secure. It's the same as it's always been. And he's never had any problems with it before when the people voting absentee were voting for him. So very confusing, quite frankly. But yeah, just a brief overview of what you have to do to get an absentee ballot in Wisconsin. You can request several ways. The request can either be done, it has to be done in writing, either through the online system MyVote, or by email, or by mailing in a snail mail request. In any event, however you request it, you need to provide a copy of your photo ID to show you are who you say you are, the same photo ID you'd need to show if you were going to vote in person. Once you've sent this in, then they'll mail you your absentee ballot, and you will have to fill it out. Like I said, you'll need a witness. And then once you filled it out and it's been properly witnessed and you signed it and your witness has signed it, both under penalty of perjury, then you have to make sure that you return it on time. Logistically, it's just harder to vote absentee in a lot of ways. And yeah, I don't see where you find the fraud.
Thank you.
I would agree with Ellen. South Carolina has a similar procedure for absentee ballots. One difference is you don't have to show a photo ID to get absentee ballot. However, either on the written application or on the online application, you have to give information that is very personal to you, in that you have to give your birth date, your social security number, the exact address where you have registered to vote, and then you get an absentee ballot. Much like in Wisconsin, you have to complete it. A witness has to see you complete it, and then you deliver it properly. It is a complicated process, as opposed to showing up at a polling place on the election day with your photo ID and going to the electronic machine and voting. And it would take such coordination to change the results of an election. I've seen no evidence of some concerted campaign fraud to change the election. In fact, the opposite. I think it's more likely that a voter could be disenfranchised, their vote not counted by absentee, because of these hurdles that are placed. And they're placed for security. I mean, for these reasons. So as for his strategy, I think it was chaotic, the sort of to just cast dispersion on the election results. One thing I would like to add, though, is because of the pandemic, unfortunately, health protocols in the United States have become polarized. And you find in general that more Democratic places are following the health protocol, Republican places are not. Here in the city of Columbia, which is many more Democratic voters, health protocols are in, mask requirements are in place. Where I have some family who lives an hour away in a rural part of South Carolina, you will never see a face mask being worn in that part of South Carolina. And therefore, the people who wanted to do absentee ballots were taking the health protocols for the pandemic seriously. They tended to be more Democratic. The Republicans were less likely. I think in this one case, I don't disagree with Ellen in general about absentee ballots, but during the pandemic, and I think that may have been more reason to question mail-in ballots, because basically Trump was questioning ballots that were more likely to vote Democratic. I don't know that for sure, but that is just an observation I have.
Okay. Maybe I'll combine a couple of the online questions. One is, and again, Ellen and Duncan perhaps, but two questions. One relates to ballot security and the presumption that paper ballots somehow seem to be presumably far more secure than online voting or virtual voting. And wouldn't online voting have solved some of this logistical and strategic problems you've raised and talked about? And then the related question is, what kind of election reform might you suggest to a President Biden?
I think that at bare minimum, the investment that we saw in voter protection this year was more than the Democratic Party has ever done. It was earlier on the ground in most states than has ever been seen, and the dividends were real. This is in part due to organization called Fair Fight, founded by Stacey Abrams, that basically fundraised to, put people like me on the ground in Wisconsin in March, when traditionally voter protection gets started in September for a presidential election year. I think that basically that allowed us to do a lot of things that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. So I do think that the Democratic Party should continue to invest in voter protection earlier, to lay the groundwork to educate voters in time to allow them to figure out how to vote. More broadly speaking, I think that, President Obama has a nonprofit right now on redistricting, which is going to be huge. It's a census year here in the United States. And I personally I absolutely despise gerrymandering because I think it corrodes the democratic process. So I think that focusing on prevention of gerrymandering to the extent possible would be something that I would be very in favor of. And just to explain to those of you who don't know what gerrymandering is basically when you split up a state into different sort of House districts. For example, like each district gets to elect one member to the House of Representatives. And you can either like split it in sort of like a reasonable looking way that has to do with, geographical and like, community locations, or you can like cut it in really weird ways so that you can create safe districts. So like a district that's just absolutely always going to elect a Democrat, or a district that's absolutely always going to elect a Republican. This happened in Wisconsin in 2010. The end result, I think, is that the Democrats would have to win something like 54% of the vote in order to win a majority in the state house because of the way they cut up the state. You put 90% Democrats in one district, that's always going to go Democratic. And then you put 60% Republicans, 40% Democrats in another district. You split it in that way, that the other district is always going to go Republican, but you dilute the Democratic vote.
Interesting.
I might add for virtual ballots, when you go to the polling place on election day, in the vast majority of states, you actually vote on an electronic machine. So those votes are relatively easily counted. It's the absentee ballots, and there were many absentee and early ballots this year because of the pandemic that are paper and have this cumbersome process. So if most of the vote, or the vast majority of votes, are actually done on voting machines at polling places on election day or during early voting, because electronic machines are used during early voting, the count is fairly quick. But that was not the case here. The statistics I've seen on the night before the election, of this election in 2020, there were 97 million early votes cast throughout the United States. In comparison, in 2016, when there was not a pandemic, 43 million early votes were cast. So there were twice the number of early votes. And what I mean by that is either an absentee ballot that had been received, or actually going to a polling place prior to the election day, which some states allow and others do not. As for reform, I'd like to just refer to, and this is not my thought, this is the thought of President Jimmy Carter, former president, was governor of Georgia. The Carter Center in Atlanta is affiliated with his presidential library, and one of their functions is they actually monitor elections at countries around the world. And prior to monitoring an election, the Carter Center has certain guidelines before they will agree to monitor. And one is that there has to be a national registry of voters, of eligible voters. And he has stated that the Carter Center would not agree to monitor elections in the United States because we do not have a centralized registry of eligible voters in the United States. And I give that as an example of a possible reform. That would be a dramatic change in election law in the United States. But it's interesting comment from a former president whose research center monitors elections, that the United States election laws do not meet their minimum requirements for observation.
Thank you. A question for Professor Mann. You offered some explanations of why first-generation Chinese Americans voted for or support President Trump. How about Chinese citizens who live in China and still support President Trump? Any insight as to their perceptions and rationales for that support?
Thank you very much for the question. I think I briefly touched up on this issue actually in my brief remarks, and I mentioned not only the first generation of Chinese immigrants who have become US citizens and who are eligible to vote, and they have some of them are strongly supporting Donald Trump, but also because of the communication, the ease of communication, all Chinese actually, either in the US or outside the US or back in China, they can actually communicate with each other instantaneously. They have all the information almost at the same time. So we also see a strong voice even for Chinese who definitely not American citizens, they are Chinese citizens. They are in China, but they also voice very strong support for Donald Trump. And their voice is very loud, as I said. I mean, is loud doesn't not really mean that they are the majority. I understand that there are many other Chinese who actually don't like Trump, don't like Republican policy. They probably don't say that as much as those who really are for Trump. I think the reasons for such kind of a strong voice of support, I mentioned a few. First is like generally Chinese are culturally and socially conservative, kind of feel that, say the US, there is a new, social development to like equality and also liberalization of society. They feel that it's going too far. And secondly, education. This is very, very, very important because every Chinese parent would want their children to get the best education in China, going to Beida, Tsinghua, US, going to Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, or Stanford. And they just feel that the affirmative action and other diversity program, they feel that this kind of program do discriminate against them. This is a kind of self-interest based kind of approach. But at the same time, actually, there is some kind of inherent discriminatory attitude. I would want to say that too much. And for Chinese, because of the traditional thinking of Chinese way of view of the world, different ethnicity groups, different nationalities, they don't have that kind of, I would say, civic education as you are a citizen in the US, you get this kind of education. You study, you know the Constitution, which definitely is entirely against discrimination. But in China, it don't develop that kind of a sensitivity. Another reason, I don't want to say that too much, I think a lot of people who, for some reason, who do not favor the government policy in China, and they find that, okay, Trump is a strong, they feel that Trump is a strong a voice for them. So for that reason, my enemy's enemy will be my friend, my enemies, my friend's enemy definitely is also my enemy. So with that kind of thinking, that they find that, okay, Trump probably represents their inherent thinking better than Joe Biden. That's all I don't know whether this will help to explain this very complex situation.
Thank you. I see a question about Michigan, which is the state next to Wisconsin. There's Lake Michigan in between the two states. And there's a controversy in Michigan that has to do with something similar to what Ellen Campbell described in Wisconsin. It has to do with Wayne County, Michigan, where Detroit is located. And there are very different voting habits in the urban area of Michigan as opposed to non-urban areas or rural areas. And apparently the vote in Detroit was overwhelmingly Democratic. And there was a big controversy about whether the vote would be certified there. Ultimately it was, but as of yesterday, President Trump apparently has invited the Republican officials from that area into the White House to try and convince them otherwise. Do we have any observations about that from anyone? And I know, although Professor Feldman's expertise is international, he happens to be from Detroit, so maybe he's been watching that development with interest, but any comments on that? That's been big news in the United States today.
I would just say, I think the numbers are consistent with past elections. And so if you just look at the numbers, the fact that the outcome was overwhelmingly Democratic does not seem to be inconsistent with past results.
Yeah, and like I said in the chat, like this goes state by state. I don't have any particular insight into what's going on in Michigan. I have colleagues that have insight into what's going on in Michigan, but my expertise is in Wisconsin.
Okay, we'll have to have Professor Gardner answer remotely about whether you could interfere politically with a vote that is so overwhelmingly in one direction. Despite the vote, could you somehow get the people in charge of certifying the vote to not certify it for reasons other than the vote outcome?
I do have one comment on that, Dean McConaughey. An unfortunate incident actually in Georgia related to South Carolina. One of our U.S. senators, Lindsey Graham, called the Secretary of State of Georgia, who is responsible for certifying the election. And there are differing accounts, but there was a suggestion that he was trying to influence the certification of the election results in favor of President Trump. That made the news here. So there seems to have been some pressure from various aspects on election officials, but it also appears that they have done their job and followed the election laws in certifying the election.
Okay, thank you all. Any other questions? Please, in 201.
Hi, Professor. I have a question maybe for Professor Feldman. My question is that it's like we have seen a huge division in the US from the election activity because there's still a lot of people are favoring Trump. So I wonder how Biden's administration is going to deal with the huge division now in the becoming US. And also another concern is that we all know Biden now has a little bit age. So is there any concern about his age and what the role could be his, or what the role could be his vice president? So that's my question. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question on divisions. Certainly the main division in the US between Democrats and Republicans, between the coasts and the middle of the country, everyone is well aware of those divisions. But as I mentioned during my talk, within the Democratic Party, there are deep, deep divisions within the Democratic Party itself. And I think that you have aspects of the Democratic Party that are very much oriented toward international engagement. And then you have other parts of the Democratic Party that actually overlap to some extent with the Trump voter. That I think if you look at the Bernie Sanders campaign and you look at the Trump campaign, I think in many instances, they are seeking to attract the same people. So I think for a Biden administration, that's going to be a key challenge, not only managing the divisions between Democrats and Republicans, but the divisions, again, within the Democratic Party itself. And on age, I know that during the campaign, Biden as a candidate had at least floated the idea of serving one term, but I don't know if anything like that has been addressed recently.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very, very much to our panel today. Ellen Campbell for taking time away from her critically important work in Wisconsin. Professor Alford, Professor Mann, Professor Feldman, for devoting yourselves to these interesting topics, and all of you on the panel for doing this so early in the morning. And to all of our audience and participants, thank you for the excellent questions and for attending and participating in this. And even though there is still lingering uncertainty about the outcome a little bit, depending on who you talk to, hopefully within a matter of days, we'll have it resolved and we'll see what course America will be on in the future. So thank you all very much. And please thank our panel one last time.